What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Nathan Holliday, and welcome back to the Between the Word podcast. Today, we're going to be reading Genesis chapter 20, and we're going to be diving into subjects such as dreams, different kinds of sins, and free will. So that will all be happening during the reflection period after the reading, so stay tuned to hear more if you're interested in those subjects. So, let's dive right into the reading now. Genesis chapter 20. Abraham removed from thence to the south country, and dwelt between Cades and Sur, and sojourned to Gerar. And he said to Sarah his wife, She is my sister. So Abimelech the king of Gerar sent and took her. And God came to Abimelech in a dream by night, and he said to him, Lo, thou shalt die, for the woman thou hast taken, for she hath a husband. Now Abimelech had not touched her, and he said, Lord, wilt thou slay a nation that is ignorant and just? Did not he say to me, She is my sister, and she say, He is my brother? In the simplicity of my heart and cleanness of my hands have I done this? And God said to him, And I know that thou didst it with a sincere heart, and therefore I withheld thee from sinning against me, and I suffered thee not to touch her. Now, therefore, restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet, and he shall pray for thee, and thou shalt live. But if thou wilt not restore her, know that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine. And Abimelech, forthwith rising up in the night, called all his servants, and spoke all these words in their hearing, and all the men were exceedingly afraid. And Abimelech called also for Abraham, and said to him, What hast thou done to us? What have we offended thee in, that thou hast brought upon me and upon my kingdom a great sin? Thou hast done to us what thou oughtest not to do. And again he expostulated with him, and said, What sawest thou that thou hast done this? Abraham answered, I thought with myself, saying, Perhaps there is not the fear of God in this place, and they will kill me for the sake of my wife. Howbeit otherwise also she is truly my sister, and the daughter of my father, and not the daughter of my mother. And I took her to wife. And after God brought me out of my father's house, I said to her, Thou shalt do me this kindness. In every place to which we shall come, thou shalt say that I am thy brother. And Abimelech took sheep and oxen, and servants and handmaids, and gave to Abraham, and restored to him Sarah his wife, and said, The land is before you, dwell wheresoever it shall please thee. And to Sarah he said, Behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver. This shall serve thee for a covering of thy eyes to all that are with thee, and whithersoever thou shalt go, and remember thou wast taken. And when Abraham prayed, God healed Abimelech and his wife, and his handmaids, and they bore children. For the Lord had closed up every womb of the house of Abimelech, on account of Sarah, Abraham's wife. Okay, so let's dive into the reflection period now. We're going to start in verse 2, and this is where we see that Abraham is making the same mistake that he had actually made previously in Genesis chapter 12. So if you remember back to chapter 12, he offered up Sarah to the Pharaoh, and he's doing the same thing again here to the king Abimelech. So it's just kind of something interesting to note there, and we're going to kind of keep that in mind because later on in the chapter, Abraham is going to explain why he did it, why he made the same mistake twice. But then moving on to verse 3, we see this is where God speaks to Abimelech in a dream, and he tells him that the woman that he has taken to be his wife actually already has a husband. So, God speaks to Abimelech in a dream. So I think this is a good opportunity to kind of talk about dreams. So let's kind of dive into that a little bit now, and what's going on? What's going on with dreams? So, on the surface, dreams can seem kind of completely random or maybe nonsensical. And the reason for that might be because it's a story, but it's being told in a very abnormal way, an abnormal fashion that we're just not used to hearing a story in our conscious state of being. So, it may appear completely random at first kind of glance at it, but I don't believe that dreams are entirely random. So what do we expect when we think of like complete randomness? What would complete randomness be like? And I tend to imagine kind of like old static on a TV. If you've ever seen an old TV, maybe you know what I'm talking about, how there's like that black and white static on it and it's just completely disordered. There's nothing there. And of course, that's not actually a true representation of complete randomness because that is probably most likely impossible to imagine. I don't think we could imagine complete randomness, but for the sake of making a point, let's just stick with that TV static example. So we have the TV and it's got static all over it. There's nothing really going on besides that static. Now let's say that faces start to appear on the TV. So pixels are starting to group together to form a picture that is recognizable to us. What we would recognize to be a face, two eyes, a nose, a mouth, something along those lines. So those pixels, they're coming together to display something of purposeful order. So that's step one. Now let's say that the faces, they have mouths that are starting to open up and close, and they're starting to move up and down, and we actually hear words then coming from the speakers of the TV that are matching the movement of the mouth that we see on the TV. So the combination of these two things, these are two levels of stimuli. They're visual stimuli and they're auditory stimuli. So we can see it with our eyes, and what we see with our eyes corresponds to what we're hearing with our ears. So those two levels of stimuli are working together synchronously with one another, and this inherently makes what's going on with the TV less random. It's becoming more ordered. And it's becoming more ordered to display a message. Some sort of message is trying to come through through the TV. So these sorts of things going on, they actively decrease entropy in the TV screen, therefore decreasing the amount of randomness that we see. Let's keep that in mind, what we just talked about with those two stimuli coming together, decreasing entropy, and now let's apply that to what we actually see in dreams. So when we dream, what are some typical things that we imagine when we dream? Well, there's probably people involved. Maybe there's animals involved. Maybe the people have specific items that they're utilizing, or maybe some sort of tool. And there's also typically some sort of story. There's some sort of unfolding and continuity to a story. Those are some typical things that we see in a dream. And that continuity that we see, we recognize it as being continuous in some sort of way, but it might be in a way that's unexpected. Maybe there's some random cuts and scenes, or maybe people are acting in ways that we wouldn't expect them to outside of the dream. They're acting in a weird way that we just would not expect that person to act. So those sorts of things may feel random on the surface because, why all of a sudden am I going from one place to another place and it just seemingly has no connection whatsoever. So, that might feel completely random, and that's where that sense of randomness actually is probably coming from. So those things are atypical, but the dream is obviously not entirely random. There is something going on there. We see faces, we see people, we're normally interacting with people in our dreams. So there is some sort of story being told there. And since there is a story being told, that inherently means that there is information embedded in that story for us to try to grasp at. So, laying it out like that, we can actually kind of think about dreams as it's kind of like the cusp of randomness and reality colliding with one another. So, when we were to dream like that, the cusp of randomness and reality colliding with one another, that kind of reminds us back to the beginning of Genesis, where we see God hovering above the waters of chaos. He's bringing about order from those waters of chaos. Very similar to what's going on in our dreams. So, I must clarify, though, that not everything that is happening in our dreams is a direct message from God. It's not all private revelation from God, and whatever we experience in our dreams and take out of it, that's God trying to tell us something. No, that is not what is going on here, and I don't want there to be confusion about that. So, the reason for that is because during our waking hours, we corrupt ourselves. We are sinners, and we miss the mark, and we experience things and take things into ourselves during our conscious hours that actually end up corrupting our experiences in our unconsciousness with our dreams. So with that disclaimer in mind, there are times though where we can examine the story that we just had in our dream if we remember it, and we can try to view that story and then reflect on it and try to maybe understand what might there be that I should get out of this. So when doing this, we want to, of course, bring it back to Scripture. You want to bring it back to Scripture. You want to bring it back to the tradition, and you want to bring it back to the church, the authority of the church. And the reason we do this is because we want to make sure that what we're experiencing in our dream might actually be a message from God rather than, some sort of distorted message that is not from God and we shouldn't listen to. So the dreams do not trump the sacred scripture, the authority of the church, or the tradition of the church. So those are things that we should definitely test it against before maybe considering it as private revelation for ourselves. But in the case of Abimelech, this does seem to be, and I'll just say it is a time when God is actually speaking to Abimelech through a dream in order to help him out from sinning. So God is offering Abimelech a very, very generous grace here. So we're going to move on to verses 4 to 7. And this is where Abimelech claims his ignorance for not knowing that Sarah had a husband. And he also says that he did not physically touch her yet. So nothing physically happened yet. So let's dive into this here and examine, what is the sin that is going on here? Because, he did claim Sarah as his own even though she was already married. So on the surface, this would seemingly fall under the sin of adultery. But we need to kind of dive deeper than that. So let's do that now. So first, I'm just going to run through some different terms and definitions so that way we can kind of establish our baseline here. What are we going to use to evaluate this story, to examine this story? So I'm going to talk about different kinds of sins, I'll give you a definition of those sins, and I'll also give you an example as well to help you understand what I'm talking about. So first, we're going to talk about material sin. So material sin refers to the objective wrongfulness of an act itself, regardless of the individual's knowledge or intent. So what this is saying is that, an act is wrong, and it doesn't really matter whether the person knew about it or not. That would be a material sin. So an example of this would be a person steals a cookie but did not know that they shouldn't steal. So it was objectively wrong that they stole the cookie. Moving on to formal sin. This involves both the objective wrongfulness of the act and the individual's subjective awareness and deliberate choice to commit that wrong. So this requires both the act being wrong and the person knew that it was wrong, essentially. So an example of this would be a person steals a cookie and knew they shouldn't steal. Moving on to the next one, we have internal sin. So an internal sin encompasses thoughts, desires, and intentions that are considered sinful, even if they are not manifested in outward actions. So internal sins, it's all in the soul. It's all inside of us. It doesn't have to make its way into the material world. So an example of an internal sin would be a person thinks about stealing a cookie, but their friend comes back before they're able to steal it. So they wanted to steal it, and they kind of already made that decision inside of themselves that, yes, I am going to do this, but they didn't end up actually getting to do it. So an external sin is the next one. And external sins are those that involve outward actions or behaviors that violate moral or religious laws. So, simple example of this would be a person steals a cookie. They actually stole it. So, now we're going to move on to sins that actually have some sort of culpability involved. There is some sort of responsibility of that person, and now they can be held accountable, actually, for their sin. So the first one here would be a venial sin. A venial sin is a lesser sin that does not result in a complete separation from God and eternal damnation in hell, as an unrepented mortal sin would. So an example of a venial sin would be a person steals a cookie but doesn't think it's a big deal. They just stole a cookie, not that big of a deal. That would be an example. Now moving on to the final one I'll discuss here. This is a mortal sin. So it's a gravely sinful act which can lead to damnation if a person does not repent of the sin before death. So there's 3 prongs that come with a mortal sin, 3 requirements that make a sin mortal. The first one is grave matter. Second one is full knowledge. And the third one is deliberate consent, or you could also say free will. So an example of this would be a person steals $1 million, knew it was wrong to steal, and chose to do it because they wanted to. So grave matter, because it was $1 million, that's a substantial sum of money. They had full knowledge, they knew it was wrong to steal, and they still did it. And they had free will. They freely chose to steal it just because they wanted to. So that example would most likely fulfill all those requirements of it being a mortal sin, assuming no weird external factors to the example. So, now that we have learned those terms and definitions together, we're going to take what we learned and use those tools to apply it to the story of Abimelech and try to figure out exactly what's going on here with him and Sarah. So, Abimelech has taken Sarah to be his wife, and he says that he has not touched her and that he did not know that she was married. So this is a material sin, but not a formal sin, because it is adultery on its surface, but Abimelech was unaware of Sarah's marital status. So materially, it is a sin, but he did not have the knowledge for it to also be a formal sin. This is an external sin and not an internal one, because it was adultery for everybody else to see, but Abimelech did not mean to commit adultery in his heart. He did not have knowledge that that's what he was doing. It wasn't his intention of his soul. But for everybody else to see in the physical world that knew the circumstances, they could clearly see that what was going on here was adultery. So that's why it would be an external sin. And then lastly, let's look at venial or mortal sin. So we'll start off with the qualifications for it being a mortal sin. So was this grave matter? Yes, it was. It was adultery. So adultery would be considered grave matter. Did Abimelech have full knowledge? No, he did not have full knowledge. He didn't know that she was married. And did he have free will? Not exactly. Not exactly, because he was lied to. He was operating under false preconditions. So yes, he freely chose Sarah, but would he have made that same decision if he knew the facts that he should have known before coming to that decision? We can't say. But we can say that it wasn't freely chosen. So, because all three of the prongs are not met, we could safely say that this was not a situation of mortal sin. And then additionally, because Abimelech did not have the appropriate knowledge, this will most likely also not even be a venial sin. So we can say that he's probably not morally guilty of adultery at all in this situation, because he did not have knowledge of what he was doing. So this might actually be why God says to him, "And I know that thou didst it with a sincere heart, and therefore I withheld thee from sinning against me, and I suffered thee not to touch her." So in this statement here, we can even actually see the sincereness of Abimelech's heart. He immediately turns back to God after he realizes what happened. So he turns right to God and he pleads with him, and he says, he says something along the lines of, "Are you going to judge the ignorant and the just?" So he actually does what we should all be doing. If we mess up, or even accidentally, he accidentally messed up. He didn't know. So if we mess up, we should turn right back to God. Be like, "God, no, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to mess up. Like, please forgive me, and let's keep going." And that's exactly what Abimelech does here. So he's actually a really great example for us of what we should do if we get some sort of calling from God where we come to realize that we've made a big mistake, and he will forgive us and allow us to turn back around like nothing happened. That's God's mercy at work right there. So for all these reasons, we can see why God is so merciful towards Abimelech. But I do want to look at verse 6 more closely. So I'm just going to read it one more time here, especially the part where it says, "Therefore I withheld thee from sinning against me, and I suffered thee not to touch her." So when I first read that, alarm bells started going off a little bit, because I was like, hold on, wait a minute. I withheld thee and I suffered thee not to touch her. That to me sounds like Abimelech doesn't have free will in this situation. And I thought free will was a promise of God. So what's going on here? Is God preventing Abimelech from making decisions? So now we're going to dive into free will. Let's cover all the tough topics today. We're going to just go into everything, solve free will really quick, free of charge, of course. Obviously, I'm kidding. But no, we will look into free will a little bit now and just kind of see what we make of it in this situation right here. So once again, let's start by defining our terms. So free will, the God-given capacity for humans to make choices between good and evil and to be held morally responsible for those choices. And then another one I'm going to include here is divine intervention. So the definition of divine intervention is God's direct and purposeful involvement in the world, acting in ways that transcend the ordinary course of events. So in order for us to understand maybe a little bit better what's going on here, I'm actually going to call on an analogy that I just heard recently at a young adult group that I was at. So I don't take credit for this analogy. It was the first time I heard it. I thought it was really good, and I also thought that it applied pretty well here. So I figured it was worth taking a look into. So the analogy goes like this. There are children playing by a cliff with no fence. Sounds like a great idea. Yeah, and that's it. That's the analogy right there. Okay, we're actually going to go into it. So there are children playing by a cliff with no fence. The children have the freedom to run around, including running off of the cliff. However, because there's no fence, the children are afraid to play because they don't want to fall off and die. Makes sense. They don't want to fall off of a cliff. So we see that the children are free here. They're free to do whatever they want. There's no boundary. But now let us add a fence by the cliff. So we're going to add a fence there to kind of block off the edge of the cliff. So this fence is technically limiting their freedom, but now the children feel safe to play in a joyous manner. So they're no longer scared of falling off the cliff. So in a sense, this fence has actually protected their freedom to play. So that's the analogy right there. The first part, they don't have a fence, technically more free because there's no boundary stopping them from doing something. But they don't feel free. So by adding that fence, they actually feel more free to continue their playing. So now, how does this relate to Abimelech? Well, if God hadn't created some sort of boundary to protect Abimelech and Sarah, then they actually would have ended up falling off a cliff of sin together. So it's likely that God just maybe added in some sort of fear, or maybe there was a lack of opportunity, something along those lines, to prevent Abimelech and Sarah from actually committing something sinful. So the reason for this might be because Sarah is a part of God's covenantal line, but it's also probably because Abimelech, his heart was already in the right place. He had a good thing in mind. He just didn't have the knowledge of what he was actually doing. So Abimelech was just, and he had a good heart and good intentions. So God adds this quote-unquote fence in order to continue what the heart was already desiring to do, which was a good thing. So rather than the fence being a boundary in this situation, we actually see that God is using a fence to maintain their freedom to do good. which was the will of Abimelech in the first place. So God helped to carry out the good will of Abimelech. And this is, how the human will and God's grace work in synergy with one another. So I find this really interesting how boundaries can actually be used to create freedom rather than diminishing freedom. Free will is just an interesting concept in general. I can't just flap my arms and start flying. I don't have wings. Does that mean that, I don't have free will because I'm not capable of doing something? Well, no, not exactly. There are boundaries to free will. We truthfully can't freely just do whatever we want. There are limits to it. So that physical limit of the human body would be one of them. I can't just flap my arms and fly. That's not an impediment on my free will. It's just not an option. So that is a boundary right there. And even the natural laws, let's think about the natural laws for a second. Well, natural laws inherently create boundaries. They prevent you from doing something and keep you within the material world of what is actually possible. But if we were to just take away the natural laws, sure, there's more freedom in a sense, but in reality, there's no freedom at all. There's no freedom at all there, because without the natural laws, we wouldn't even be alive. We wouldn't have life or this planet or any of what we see. So we wouldn't be able to make decisions in the first place. So there are boundaries that actually are necessary in order to even have free will. And I like to think of this example. I know there's research backing this up, but let's think about going into a grocery store. You go into a grocery store and you're looking for peanut butter. I don't know. You're looking for peanut butter. That's just the example I'm going to go with. Let's say there's 100 different brands of peanut butter. You start to think to yourself, what the heck? What's the difference with all this, with all these different companies of peanut butter? I don't know which one to pick. There's too many options, and that's a serious problem, is that too many options actually stunt our freedom to choose anything, period. So what we actually see is that people actually do better, with less options. Not zero options. We still want options, but we don't want too many options. When there are too many, we feel like we can't pick anything at all. So we become frozen. So I'm sure many of you have actually heard that before. So let's say that there was maybe only 5 options. Okay, now I can actually look at the different products available and evaluate one against the other to come to a conclusion of which one I might want to purchase. That's more possible than evaluating 100 different things and trying to figure out, which one's better than the other. It's nearly impossible. So that boundary of there being some sort of limitation of our free will actually allows us to make a decision in the first place. So that's how boundaries can actually preserve our free will, and kind of tying it back to the cliff example, allow us to continue to play in a joyous manner on the earth. So moving on to verse 7, we see God tells Abimelech to give Sarah back to Abraham. And he says that if he doesn't, then he will die. That seems pretty harsh. But this is because God has already given Abimelech the grace. He gave him the grace, and now he's given him, this knowledge that what he has done is wrong. So if he continues in this way, well, then he's going to be culpable for his actions, and he will then commit a sin because he has the knowledge now. So God's just saying, hey, I know that wasn't your intention, and now I'm giving you the grace so that way you can see what you've done, and just give her back and return to what you were doing before, and it's going to be okay. So in this, we can actually kind of see how ignorance is bliss. Abimelech was ignorant. He had no idea that Sarah was already married to Abraham, and in that ignorance, he has not actually committed a sin yet. So, yeah, ignorance is bliss in some sort of sense, but ignorance is not joy. So, knowing more actually allows you to make better decisions. So, if you live this kind of ignorant life, yeah, sure, it's some sort of bliss in a sense, in that you're not going to be culpable for doing bad things, but maybe you're also not really culpable for doing good things. You're kind of just floating. You're kind of just floating through life, uh, and you're not really making any serious strides then. So I know for me personally, like I just like to learn stuff. Like I'm always trying to learn more and more, because I want to know, and I want to know what can I be doing better, and maybe what are some areas that I'm struggling with, and how can I improve that. So, for me personally, like I've recognized that, if I choose not to live in ignorance, and if I choose to know, like it's a gift and a curse. Like, sure, yes, you can, if you know more, and if you have more information, and more knowledge of what's going on, then yes, you can make better and better decisions. You can do better things. However, if you know more, but you also continue to do bad things, well, you become more culpable for those bad things, and you actually can start, sliding your way down into hell. So it's a slippery slope. You kind of have more variation of responsibility, I guess you could say. So choosing not to live in ignorance, yes, it allows you to purposely choose better decisions rather than bad decisions. And you start to work your way up Jacob's ladder a little bit. You start to climb the stairs of heaven. But you just have to be really responsible, and you want to make sure you're in prayer, and make sure that you are doing things that are hopefully in alignment with God's will. Because if you start doing things that are bad, you're going to be way more culpable for them, rather than if you were just ignorant. So it kind of opens up that door, if you will. Maybe it's kind of like the Matrix. Like, once you unlock that door, once you take that pill, there's no going back. Once you know that this is a sin, and you shouldn't do that, well, you are now responsible. And that's what we see here with Abimelech. That's what God's telling Abimelech. What you have done is a sin, and now you know that. So if you don't turn away from that sin, you are going to be held responsible for it. So moving on to verse 11, this is where we find out why Abraham lied once again about his marriage with Sarah. And once again, it's because of fear. Abraham's not trusting in the Lord. He says that he was scared that these people in this city were not God-fearing people. So he didn't trust in the Lord's protection again. And he fell short in this way. But Abimelech, he ends up giving Sarah back to Abraham, and he gives Abraham gifts as well. And the Lord ends up restoring Abimelech, as well as his close ones, for doing the right thing. So Abimelech, at least in this chapter, seems like he actually did a really good job. He found out which ways he's missing the mark. God reveals it to him through grace. And once he receives that private revelation, bang, his eyes turn, he's focused right back on God, says, I'm sorry, and actually does things to say no to that sin, and to make reparation for what he has done. So, yeah, I think, at least in this story, we should strive to be like that. That's a really good example of how we should be. So I know in this story, Abimelech makes it look really easy to just accept God's grace, and to just turn away from sin and go right back to God. And yeah, he sets this kind of almost gold standard right here of how we should be when we recognize these things. But I also just want to say that, sometimes it's not that easy, and it is okay to be patient with yourself. As long as we're trying to strive in the right direction, and there's habitual things that happen, and maybe we lived a life that wasn't in accordance with this before, and just remember that God is merciful. He's merciful. He wants to help you out. He understands that we're human, and we are going to fall short. But he knows the intentions of the heart better than anybody else, even better than yourself. So, as long as you're making a genuine effort, and you realize you've done something bad, you ask for forgiveness, you repent, and you turn back to God, he will forgive you of those things, and ask him for the strength to continue in his grace, to continue in the Holy Spirit. Um, that's what we can do. That's what we can do, and just trust in the Lord. That's all you can really do. There's gonna be times where we fall short. I can certainly admit to that. Like, it happens all the time. Probably like in ways I don't even know yet. Just like Abimelech when he didn't even know yet. Um, but in time, that will probably be revealed to me as well. So yeah, I guess just trust in the Lord. Don't pull an Abraham and try to take it onto yourself like he does. He tries to, I don't know, pull a fast one, I guess. Um, that's not going to work out. So yeah, that's how I guess I'll leave it here. So I hope you learned something today, and I hope that this was worth your time. And as always, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Thank you for being patient with me. There was issues with recording this reflection, actually. This was my second run through. If you couldn't tell, I changed shirts between the reading and the reflection, and that's because I had recorded this reflection before and it got corrupted, so I had to re-record it. But, maybe there's something there for me to take out of that. So, yeah, but I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. This was Genesis chapter 20, and I will see you in the next one. God bless you all. Hope you have a good rest of your week. And yeah, until next time, I'm Nathan Holliday. This was the Between the Word podcast. Have a good one.